Welcome to Film Independent Presents. I am Louay, Senior Manager of International Programs at Film Independent. Before we get started with today's very exciting Q&A, I have to give some praise to our loyal supporters. Thank you to our incredible lead sponsor, the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, and our screening partner, Vision Media. And with that, I'm honored to introduce our guests for today's panelists, Director, Producer, Editor, Megan Mylan. Hi, Megan. Producer Robin Hessman and co-producer Hazem Obid. I watched Simple as Water this weekend, and being Levantine myself from that region, I was utterly moved. The film masterfully and intimately tells the stories of Syrian families, their struggles to keep their families together, which is, family being together in our region is very important. And also, the film depicted their endurance despite all the hardship that they have been facing since 2011.
غادي لما طلعت بالبحر تعرف شو راح يصير معك؟ كيف بتربط مصير عائلة كاملة بالمجهول؟
The asylum office has decided not to grant your application.
أنا ماني قاطعة الأمل خالكم.
محمد علي الفتح تعين ضرب ولاد ضربوا.
Since the civil war broke out in Syria, now almost 10 years ago, there has been several highly acclaimed documentaries by Syrian filmmakers like Firas Fayyad, Talal Derki, Wa'ad al-Khatib, Usama Muhammad, and Wiam Simav Badr Khan. I mean, to name a few. Megan, I know you've made documentaries in different parts of the world, in Brazil and Sudan and India. What drew you this time to tackle, the Syrian tragedy?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for watching so closely and feeling the film with your personal connection to the region and such. I really came into this film as a human being more than a filmmaker. Like so many people around the world, as the intense exodus and migration caused by the Syrian war was happening now about 6 years ago, I just couldn't stop reading and watching and feeling and, just that very core human thing that people who had successfully fled a war zone were then being forced to put them and their children on smugglers' boats or try and use smuggler routes to get through barbed wire. I just couldn't reconcile that was the world we were living in. And so I was starting every morning with hours of reading and particularly photographs. And I think it was particularly as a mother, I had a 3-year-old at the time who's now 9. So again and again, it was photographs of Syrian parents or others in the region, but cradling their children. And as you said, there was just, there's always that life cycle of the coverage, right? There's the people on the ground with their cell phone cameras and the embedded journalists, and then the filmmakers and the book writers we come later, right? But there was such amazing coverage coming out of this horrific situation. And so I did grapple for a long time. If you're a filmmaker and you get pulled into something that deeply, if your heart and your head is, all focused on something, you have to ask yourself, is there a film for me to make here? And I was slow to decide that there was, because there was so much coverage, because I have no personal connection to Syria or the region. I don't come from a family with a history of displacement, but it was that perspective as a mother that ended up pulling me in. I felt like the question I kept trying to reconcile is, how would I say everything's going to be okay? When you have at 3, protecting physically is still very much your job, but it also is so much about setting up the idea that the world is a place that's going to embrace you, that you have a right to joy, you have a right to imagine a future. And so it was again and again looking at photographs of parents and their children that pulled me in. And I felt like that sort of elemental primal perspective of parenthood, of being a mother, was a valid point of entry. It was something that I could share with people who I don't have anything obviously in common with, and an aspect of war that I felt like I hadn't seen done in quite the way that we ended up intending to do it. So that was the initial kernel.
And you know, in the Eastern Mediterranean, especially in the Levant, the issue of displacement is nothing new. I mean, 100 years ago, it was the Armenians, and then, you know, we have Palestinians, and then the Lebanese and Iraqis, and now the Syrians. The difference here is that with the Syrian also the magnitude of the displacement, and then it was all depicted on video, like you said. Robin, how did you get involved in this project, and what drew you to it?
Megan and I have known each other about 20 years. I am a filmmaker who also is drawn to telling international stories and bringing them to the US. And when she showed me her first footage, I was really awestruck by the degree of intimacy and how the love was almost palpable on the screen. I will say I also was at that moment a mother of a 3 and a 4-year-old. That was something we had in common. I had also just lost a parent. And so family and the primacy of family and the importance was very much on my mind. But as I looked at the footage of her early shoot and saw not only this gorgeous cinematography, both the kind of soaring and massive scale that she had captured and the beautiful intimate moments, we talked a lot about her approach. And what really struck me and appealed to me was that behind all of this kind of gorgeous filmmaking and the sort of the approach of artistry of cinema, it all hangs on this scaffolding of really rigorous research and kind of journalism ethics. And that combination of the artistry of the cinematic approach and the beauty of the kind of humanism of how this film was going to be made with the deep, deep research and kind of journalistic deep dive in made me want to fully be in. So, and here we are 5 years later.
Yeah. And Hazem, I'm sure for you it was very personal, being Syrian. How did you get involved in this project, and why was it important for you to be part of it?
It's actually because it's personal. At the beginning, I didn't want to get involved in it at all. I've been contacted through a common friend who's also a producer on this film. And at the beginning, it was like, it's a film about refugees, Syrians. And there was only the German part, which they wished someone who could help just in Germany at the beginning. So basically, I had some kind of reaction because back in back a couple of years ago, it was all that you can hear about in the German media. There was no new parties coming in because of refugees. It was just like, get off the subject. It was like really repulsing to hear it. But when we talked about what is this, basically this thing that Megan concentrate on, which is, this is not about refugees. Like this is a film about family ties in a certain in an extraordinary circumstances, and this changed everything. And yeah, that was then history.
We got you.
It wasn't like I was hard to get. No, that's not what I mean.
You played a little hard to get.
It was just my feeling, talking about it. I felt like, no, not again about refugees. At least I don't want to. I've been tired hearing about it, and I didn't want to participate in it. But it's a film about families at the first place. Yeah.
And I mean, other films about Syria are often very personal, like Wissam Tanyus, We Are From There, or Wa'ad al-Khatib for Sama. or focused on one narrative, like the films of Firas Fayyad and Talal Darki. I mean, the Syrian refugee crisis remains like the largest displacement crisis in the world. So I'm sure there are so many stories to be told. I would love to hear from you, Megan. I mean, why did you decide you wanted to tell 5 stories and not focus only on one? Because really each one of them could have been a feature. And were you worried about how you were going to weave them together in a way that, you know, after seeing so many movies, like Hazem said about Syria, were you worried about how, if you were still going to be able to surprise us and move us?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, as you said, you've named so many beautiful films, and I think that, and you touched on the scale of this. So this is a story that warrants many tellings. And so very early, you know, we were sort of in the mix early on. I mean, this film took a lot of years, and we very quickly, I decided we're not going to try and be the first out of the gate. We're not going to be the telling of this. I mean, what arrogance that would be, you know, this warrants many tellings, and we are all part of, you know, water on the rock of sort of helping people understand and feel what this displacement, what the impact, with the very human personal impact is. Very quickly on, once I decided that sort of point of entry was going to be parenthood, my natural instinct, I make observational character-driven films, at first was like, okay, how do we find the perfect family and go on that journey story? And it just felt anemic to me for the scale and for the fragmented, fractured nature of this experience, that it was like this series of, you know, cotton Kafkaesque limbos, families separated, children taking on adult responsibility, that one narrative would give it a tidiness, a neatness, that the experience not be representative of that experience. And so I quite quickly landed on the idea of multiple storylines, but then I wanted you to be immersed in a moment that felt not longitudinal, not like a year in the life of any of these families, but really just dropping in on any given Tuesday or Wednesday, like a lot, because I feel like, especially with parenthood, a lot of it is really the dailiness. It's not necessarily the banner moments. And so I felt like if we intercut, it would give the narrative this idea that there's moments of resolution and that we're waiting for things to change. And that's not really the point of the film. The point is, like, as close as I can to get you to feel what it felt like to be these families in that given moment in time. And so, and I have a film I love called 32 Short Films About Glenn Gould. And I rewatched that, and I had this, okay, you know, and in that film, each chapter is a different style. And so I had some grand ideas for not very many days, to be honest, because I did have a 3-year-old. I hadn't made a feature since he had been born. I thought, you know, maybe stay in your own wheelhouse. And this sort of very patient, intimate verite comes to me somewhat organically. And then it was, you know, just finding the families, which is not just, that's everything for this film, right? And so there was a huge outreach. I mean, Robin touched on sort of a journalistic, but it's also, you know, it's a relationship building. It's a massive relationship building. And so our first calls are to people like Hazem. Even we had 2 Syrian co-producers who worked across stories. Hazem came on a little later. And then, as you know, I mean, reaching out first to Syrians who have firsthand experience with this, and then to journalists, people working in the field, refugee advocates, NGOs, and trying to sort of find these little research teams who could go out and start identifying families that were going to be able to give us insights into some of these common through lines that were true to the Syrian experience, but are also true to the experience of displacement historically and sadly likely going forward. And so some of the things I touched on about, you know, when children are forced to take on adult responsibilities, or fathers are forced to, you know, basically park themselves in an affluent country is the only role they get, or be on a FaceTime call, you know, and so we were looking for each of those, and it was a horror that half of Syria had been forced to flee. It was an advantage for our film that we had a choice of an amazing network of people to be part of these little curated teams. So in each country, we had sort of a different field producer often partnered with a freelance journalist who would go out and start the fundamental thing of relationship building for each of these stories.
Yeah, I mean, the filming in 5 different countries showed the magnitude of this crisis, right? And this,
Right.
and where, you know, the refugees and this, inside Syria, and how they've been affected. And also these like 5 stories in your film also reminded me of the, you know, 24-hour news cycle and how it, you know, highlights, you know, an issue and then it's forgotten. And in your film, except for Yasmin, there is no happy ending. You know, and I think this is why it was so poignant for me, because we hear about the scene, we are moved, and then suddenly forgotten. So I thought this was really very different from the other films that I've seen on Syria. And the other thing that I noticed is that, you know, none of the filmmakers or the crew were visible in the film. There were no talking heads, no statistics on refugees or interviews or any other filmmakerly intervention of any kind. What was the decision behind this approach?
Yeah, so I'm somewhat a verite purist. I love that observational style. I mean, I love watching other kinds of films too, but this is what comes to me most organically. I feel like it gives me space to let the audience have their own experience with the film to a greater degree. Even though, you know, we're choosing the families, we're deciding when to film, what makes it in the editing. But there's a space in there for you to have your own relationship and for you to decide where in the frame your eye is going to land and what are the moments that resonate most. It felt, and it also felt like a way for someone who was coming in with the connection or lack of connection, personal connection that I had. The connection I had was motherhood, and that was something that I could, once, you know, we had gotten the collaboration from the families in the film and they had chosen to work with us and chosen what layers they were going to reveal, that was a style of filmmaking that just would, you know, really give them that agency. Our conversations are really, you know, you're in charge and we're here and we're grateful you've invited us in. You want us to stop? We stop. And then we're going to ask afterwards, hey, why did you want us to stop? Might we do that tomorrow? You know, kind of thing, but really giving them that control. And so it's really just sort of a flow, you know, with them. So it was always, you know, that was always the intention, was to, as much as possible, you know, it's sort of what it felt like for us to be an invited guest, not a participant. You know, it's this, other filmmakers have better phrases for it than I do, but it's like, I feel like it's like I was invited in at the table, you know, it's this sacred space of family, such a privilege that they let us in. But you're at the table, but you're not communicating by talking, right? So you're just, but I hope that intimacy, I think it, you know, it comes out of just a lot of trust and respect. So
yeah, I noticed that throughout the film, and also at the very end with the fathers. Mm-hmm. I thought that was really, I could tell that there was trust, because for a Syrian or a Levantine father, I mean, they take so much pride in being the, you know, protector of the family and the provider, and these fathers aren't. So I noticed that immediately, because they were so candid about their inability to provide for their families. So I could tell that there was this trust, and I could tell that also with the children. I mean, the film opens in Greece with these bright, cheerful colors, which struck me immediately, because, you know, I was expecting more like gloomy opening, because, you know, this is about the Syrian refugee crisis, and I'm sure it's hard to film the Mediterranean in any other way, especially in the summer. But it made so much sense for me, seeing these children in Greece on the docks playing innocently. It kind of like because I grew up in the civil war in Lebanon, so it kind of reminded me, we used to play despite the war. But I loved also the contrast of these ships, whether the cargo or the tourist ships, docking in the background. because it felt like the children playing on the dock were like at the edge of this happiness, but not belonging to it. And the tourists looking, at them, it kind of like struck me also as a viewer and the privilege we are in as viewers. But anyway, this is like my personal experience with the scene, but with the children, it was so amazing to watch the children throughout the film because they are unaware of the camera.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about that, especially with Faiz, the child in Turkey.
Faiz.
I mean, when he said, I can't even talk about it without choking, when he said, I want to be their father, it's talking about, his siblings.
Yeah.
And he was like a preteen, I think,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
can we talk about how you manage that with the children, which I think is such an achievement?
I mean, I think the thing, and just to touch on you talking about the play, I mean, that was so important because I feel like, of course, as a parent, you have to keep your child physically safe and, fed and safe from violence. But I really think of it as a preserver and creator of joy as one of my main jobs, and children should have the right to move out of innocence slowly at their own pace and to have that. So, and I felt like Yasmin was keenly aware of that, and the fact that she chose to, after having lost a child in those same waters, that she was determined to not only take her children back to the seashore, but to encourage the littlest one to be brave and go further. And, she was like, life is going to be good. And that's part of my, job, is to give you that belief. Faiz, I mean, what luck we had connecting with him and his family. I mean, he is the most soulful 12-year-old I've ever encountered. And, one of my sort of key directions for the crew, for the cinematographers, was just hang on faces. You cannot hang on a face long enough. And thank God with Faiz and that face that just plays all of the emotions across of it. He was such an old soul and taking on such tremendous responsibility in that household. We kept getting the translation back and I kept pushing our translators. It's too formal for a 12-year-old. It's too formal. And they said, no, that's how he's speaking. He is so adult, in his comments. And and that was, it was, I think emotionally, that was probably the hardest chapter to be in that space with them. I felt even like all of the little siblings knew what that mom was grappling with. She was so tortured. He was so tortured. I'm happy to report, not that life got simple, but they did not go to the center, as wonderful as an offer of Beatty is. And there's so many families where that's absolutely the best option, but they decided to stay together. But then that meant that he also didn't enroll in school. So, but it is what he, clearly makes clear he wanted, that his soul of his family, they needed to be intact, and that was going to be. But it was emotionally very intense to be with them during those days.
You mentioned Yasmin losing her child on the journey, and at the end, the father also mentioned, but you don't focus their story on this tragedy. It was very succinct. I felt it was very, like you weren't trying to take advantage of this tragedy, but the pain was still very palpable. Why did you take this approach and not focus on that loss, huge loss?
Because I'm a human being. I just, you get into stories with people who have experienced this unspeakable, loss that shouldn't be. It's so fragile. It's so intensely emotional, but it isn't all they are, right? And so that we were so focused on giving people their complexity and the layers. And so as to not be defined by that moment, or as you said, to sensationalize it and to let it come through. And honestly, that was really sort of in the arc of our days filming. Everything is not exactly insequential. I'm not quite that much of a purist, but it really did sort of unfold exactly like that. And she's so strong. I never saw, we have that one tear that at first her children didn't notice. And I never saw her eyes even water another time we were with her. So I'm always striving to represent it as true to that way. Everyone experiences this differently, right? And so I'm trying to be as true to the way they shared with us and experienced. And so giving sort of that mix and letting you get to engage and know somebody before you know something so intimate and powerful in their lives. First, you know them, you meet them without that.
And I also noticed one scene with Yasmin where she is sweeping her living space. I mean, they live under this bridge. And although the scene seems probably to a lot of you were just, a scene from the mundanity of daily life. But for me, it moved me because I know how important it is for Syrian or Levantine families to keep their homes clean. I mean, the homes are always immaculately clean. So for me, this scene also, like I was like almost in tears because she's cleaning up like this living space under the bridge just to keep some kind of semblance of normalcy. And I noticed these cultural nuances depicted throughout the film. How did working with Syrians on the film help you capture these, cultural nuances that might have been, regarded as just daily life?
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, I think anyone who sees the film will understand how fundamental our Syrian crew and the relationships and having them notice things as we were filming and in the edit and you're right. Like all of the homes were so immaculate, particularly with Yasmin. It was there was like this little Zen thing within this tent, this tiny little tent under an overpass. But that was such a key piece, was to sort of give you this sense of like, when you're in this privileged space of family and how special it is, you for moments can kind of forget the fact that they're in some industrial setting. Because everybody, I mean, including the men in Germany, I mean, they're in this like dorm, this tiny dorm, these adult men sharing like 100 square feet or something. And yet, they have to have these very intimate personal conversations in these crazy settings. So in just every turn of the film, the Syrian involvement was fundamental. There are places though where I do think also it is just what was. It's what the people in the films were offering up to us. I think you couldn't. I don't think you could spend time with Yasmin and in that home, or similarly with Fayez, who was the housekeeper of his home in Turkey, and not see that was a point of pride, right? To feel that was something that mattered, and it wasn't because there were outside visitors there. That was the routine, and so the routines of daily life, and I felt that with everyone, of like trying to hold on to something that felt home, something that felt normal. Like the bedtime routines were the same every night, the blankets just so, and this little stuffy to hold, and like, we are going to have family life, we are going to have normalcy, even with all the chaos around us. And so with each of the families, those rituals of daily life, it was very clear that those were really important.
And for you, Robin, like producing a film shot in 5 different countries, I'm sure was very challenging, and especially Syria being one of those countries where you don't have access. I believe you guys didn't go to Syria, but you had a crew in Syria filming secretly there, right?
Yes.
So,
well, I will say, thank goodness we were doing this now and not in the days before Skype and WhatsApp and all of the incredible ways that we can be connected. In Syria, we have a team of 2 amazing women who are in the film under pseudonyms. They are based in Damascus, and we spoke all the time on WhatsApp and Skype. Megan was directing remotely. She went to meet them in Beirut, and they workshopped and talked about footage in Beirut. But of course, it wouldn't be safe for the family, where there are foreign American crew or international or crew there, and or safe for the crew. So it was the best way to make it work, but also it allowed for the incredible intimacy of the story in Syria. Our our team would travel with the camera equipment hidden under toys and diapers, going in between Damascus and Masayaf, and they were just allowed in Dia's home, and their relationship built was, you know, beautiful. Dia was matchmaking for one of them who wasn't married, and they became incredibly close, and you can see that on the screen. That kind of trust is there, and they filmed in the orchard and they filmed in the home. One thing as you were thinking, one thing that as we were just beginning to show this film to the world, that you hear people's reactions that aren't always in your head as you're thinking about it. And of course, we've always talked about children taking on adult responsibilities or children taking on the role of parents. But one thing that keeps coming back to me that I keep hearing is the film being seen as brotherhood and the roles of brothers and relationships of brothers, and that I hadn't really thought about. And that's both, of course, with Fayez and his brother and Omar taking care of Abid, but also in Dia's story, that although we don't see Muhammad, the relationship between Muhammad and Yazan is talked about so beautifully. And that, I feel, is all a testament to our incredible crew of women who gave that space for Dia to be so completely herself in that, and share the degree of vulnerability that she did in that scene.
Well, I mean, that vulnerability is also across all the stories, and I feel you were able to depict it because of the trust that was between, the filmmakers and your families. Like I said earlier, you leave us wanting to know more about these families. We really, selfishly as a viewer, you want to hear that they had, everything is great now. They found, happiness and a better place to live and all of that. But you didn't do that, because this is the reality of the millions of refugees that are still in Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan and elsewhere in Europe. But you bookended your film with the story of Yasmin, which has a better ending. What was the reason for that? Why did you want to leave us with a little bit of hope at the end?
Because I wanted to leave you with a little hope. Otherwise, it's a lot, this film, right? It's a lot. And I wanted to include a chapter with fathers in it. That felt like a really intense experience, that not being, and especially as I got to know more and more about Syrians and the way, people become Abu Muhammad, right? Your name becomes your firstborn, you are father of, and so it's such a fundamental defining part. And so we didn't know it was going to be Safwan, Yasmin's husband. There's actually 2 years goes by, but not 100. They were apart for 2 years, about a year and a half between when we filmed with her and when they were reunited, maybe a little longer than that. But once we got kind of word, we stayed in touch. I mean, that was one of the other wonderful things about having Hazem and our other Syrian producers, is that even if the crew, we had a Danish cameraman and me coming from New York, but even if we left, they stayed. And so those relationships stayed. So we stayed in touch with Yasmin. We had met Safwan through FaceTime while we were in Greece and talked with him. And once it became clear that they were sort of getting closer up on the lists, then that felt like, okay, that's going to feel really, really meaningful. And we didn't know, because you don't that they weren't going. I mean, Hazem was intensely in touch. We didn't know that they were going to then be separated again after they arrived, right? So, I mean, Germany does an amazing job of offering social support. They also have some somewhat rigid rules, and you cannot apply for family-sized housing until the family is actually feet on the ground in Germany. So what that meant, nor can you allow more people in that tiny, I mean, that family would have happily crammed into that little dorm room with him and all slept in the same bed. This little boy was like, I want to sleep with you forever, right? And but they wouldn't allow that either. So then you start realizing we're going to have this resolution, and then it's going to be pulled apart. And as a human being, that felt horrible. And I have to admit, as a filmmaker, it felt appropriate, because it's not resolution. I mean, I wish I could tell you everyone in the film is doing great. And in some ways, a lot of them are. But the damage goes on, right? And I mean, everyone was very focused, forward focused, resilience focused. Yasmin, I mean, Hazem we were in touch with Yasmin. She just sent pictures. The kids are enormous. Fatin, her daughter, is a full-on teenager. They're speaking German. But can I say like every day is happy and, perfect? No, I'm sure not. It's challenging. I mean, Omar and Abid, the brothers in, can I do a laundry list of where everyone is now? It's like I have to get them off. Also in Germany, again, with Hazem's assistance, fortunately, pretty quickly after we finished filming, Abdullah, Safwan's roommate, was granted asylum. So sort of a technicality, the government didn't respond to his appeal in time. And so he was able to bring his wife and children. And then she was getting treatment for cancer. She had, in the film, we touch on the fact that she had gone through chemotherapy without him there. And so that was, I felt like he was just going to reach through the phone and pull his children to Germany. He was, that connection was so strong. And then Omar and Abid, the brothers in our US chapter, similarly, pretty quickly after we finished filming, Abid, the younger brother, was granted asylum. And so that meant he was resolved and safe here and helped Omar's case. Omar's still undecided. His court date is it 2023, Robin?
Yeah.
So he's still in that, but he actually is married a Syrian woman whose family had all come to Houston. And so they moved to Houston's and they have 2 children, 2 little girls already. So he has a big sense of family, and Abid graduated high school, and Omar was able to get an interview. Finally, that's all he needed. I mean, and it's so, true to this experience. He had almost finished undergrad in Aleppo, and he just got through some human resource department and got an interview. And so he's a quality assurance, computer quality assurance technician. He was headhunted away, and they flew him out to Seattle, Amazon, trying to hire him away. So he's doing really well. And then as I touched on in Turkey, that Fayez family did stay in touch and intact. And Dia doesn't have resolution, but I spoke with her last week, and which we aren't in frequent contact, but it was amazing. And together we spoke, and she's really, she said grateful, but for Muhammad's story to be out there, she doesn't want him forgotten. And so it was really just powerful to have her telling us how meaningful it was that people were going to be experiencing her son and learning more about him. And so I was.
And she's very, very, very happy that we are now speaking about it. Because to her, it's this is why she's in the film. Just
and I think
to keep the story alive.
And I think this is why it's so important to keep telling the stories of the Syrian refugees. Like I said, this region we've had displacement for 100 years, and maybe if we keep telling these stories, perhaps this history repeating itself will stop. We were moved by the endurance of the family devotions you were able to depict, and I want to thank you again for sharing your film with us and with the world, telling the stories of these really amazing people. Thank you.
Thank you for feeling it so deeply. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louay.
Thank you. Simple as Water will be available starting on November 16th on HBO and HBO Max. Make sure you watch it.